2 days away from the Bruins game, and Oregon, they can answer a lot of questions this week.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time. Once again for Locked On Ducks, I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200, 200 in bonus bets. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. 3 keys to victory and some of your guys' questions all coming up on today's show. But the first thing we're talking about today is what can Oregon actually prove? What can they showcase on Saturday? So this is a question that I posed to the Locked On Ducks insiders out there, who I very much appreciate. It got a handful of responses, many of which echoed my own thoughts. First and foremost, I think Oregon can showcase that the Oregon State game wasn't a fluke. Because so far through 3 games, you have, if we do a little bit of quick math, 66% approximately of Oregon's games have not been performances that will live up to the standard that a lot of Oregon fans or people like myself have set for this team this year. Because they have Big Ten title aspirations, they have national championship aspirations, and if you play the way that you did against Idaho or against Boise State, that's not going to cut it. But the way you played against Oregon State, it was this collective sigh of relief amongst Oregon fans, like, oh, okay. So that team is in there. But if you come out off a bye against a bad UCLA team who had to play last week, and you look the way you did against Idaho, where you have the sorts of lapses that you had against Boise State, I think the concern level that was certainly lowered, but not all the way to the ground floor against the Bees, I think that concern level goes back up. So I think showing that Oregon is more likely to be the team that played against Oregon State than the one that played against Boise or Idaho. And I think that Boise game is a better game than people might realize. It was just too close for comfort. And it shouldn't have been as close as it was. But we'll talk about that more a little bit later on today's show. But that's the first thing. I think that this Oregon team can prove to themselves and can prove to fans. I know that people in that locker room or anyone around the program not concerned with what media types or national pundits or the college football, playoff committee or what anybody thinks, right? Dan Lanning, you hear him talking in Ducks versus them all the time. Who are we playing this week? Playing Oregon. Well, if they go out and they play well enough to be the best version of Oregon this week, I think a lot of Oregon fans will say, okay, this team's in a groove, the team is rolling. The other thing, too, is not that this necessarily matters, because it doesn't in the grand scheme of things. All that matters is how they play on October 12th. But for Oregon fans, if you want to be able to feel good going into the Ohio State game, you don't deliver a dud here. Off a bye, bad team, last time out you played well. Trio of factors where you got to look and say, okay, Oregon should play well. I expect them to play well. I think they will. I also thought they would to begin the season. But I think that's the first question that I think Oregon can answer this week is, what was Oregon State an aberration, or are we making Boise State and particularly Idaho a distant memory with every passing game? Another question that can get answered this week is the offensive line. Same sort of deal. What was the Oregon State game just a matter of going up against an inferior opponent that didn't have high-level talent in the trenches, which they don't? Or did the offensive line really find something? I tend to think it's the second one, because that unit played well in the second half against Boise State, where you have Connerly, Strother, Poncho, Harper, and Ajani left to right. That's going to be the starting unit because Matthew Bedford got injured last week in practice, aggravating the injury that has kept him out of every game so far this season. So whether or not the offensive line is actually fixed, like, you have a data point to think, okay, the offensive line's improved, the offensive line has figured it out. You don't have enough to feel confident going into Ohio State or Michigan, whose defensive fronts, both of them, are nasty. And that's what we thought coming into the year. That's what we have seen. Go ask USC how good that Michigan defensive line is. It's really, really good. Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham, guys are studs. You look at the way Ohio State plays defense, it's been very good this year. And they start with how they play in the trenches with guys like JT Tuimoloau. So I think that is a significant question that Oregon can answer this week. Another one that came in, this was not a thought that I had in terms of what question Oregon can answer, questions, plural, Oregon can answer going into this game, that came from a Locked On Ducks insider was how physical are our offensive and defensive lines as we head into tougher conference games. UCLA is going to be an okay barometer of how the defensive line matches up. You know, they struggled stopping the run against Ashton Genty. They did really well against the Beavs. They did really well against Idaho. There is not a running back on Ashton Genty's level that Oregon is going to face in the next couple of weeks between UCLA this week or Michigan State next week. But certainly, if Oregon's defensive line is as good as I think it is, and how good, frankly, I think it's looked for the most part through the first 3 games, UCLA shouldn't be able to run the football in a big way. Their offensive line has really struggled. It's just a reset year. It is a reset. It is a rebuild. It is a tear it down to the studs sort of year for UCLA. Oregon should have the talent advantage at every single position group, including and especially defensive line versus the Bruins offensive line. And if the defensive line struggles to pressure Ethan Garbers in this game, or if they struggle to stop the run and get a push up front, I think that should worry Oregon fans about how they play against Ohio State, because this is a team on paper that you should have a significant advantage against in that area. And Ohio State on paper, you're just trying to break even, because that is a really, really talented roster. So last question, and I wonder if we'll get a chance to see this, but another Locked On Ducks insider asked how good are Oregon's backup quarterbacks. Well, we saw Dante Moore against Oregon State. I'd love to see him in this game against UCLA. I'm sure it'd be a little bit sweet for Dante Moore to play against his former team. I don't know if he cares a ton. I don't even know if he's been asked about that, or if he's been media availability this week. But if Dante Moore gets into the game, things have gone according to plan. And that's what Oregon is capable of achieving here. If you're Oregon, I'm now speaking to the Oregon football team, any and all who might listen to or watch this show, which would be pretty cool. If you play the way you're capable, Dante Moore gets some run this week. How good are the backup quarterbacks? Well, I don't know that Dante Moore's a radically different guy than what he was last year, which is he could play, but he's not going to be anywhere near what his full potential is as a quarterback. Now, I'm sure he's improved in the offseason. He still hasn't, played live game reps when you're in a serious game situation. So, if Dylan Gabriel, God forbid, were to go out, that'd be a significant loss. But has Oregon had worse backup quarterback situations? Yes, 100%. Jeff Locke, that wasn't it. When they were going back and forth with him and Taylor Alley, when Vernon Adams got hurt, that was a problem. I don't think you'd have that level of drop-off, but Dylan Gabriel's a starter for a reason. I hope we get to see Dante Moore. I think the sooner he gets into the game, the better things are going. So are Oregon's backup quarterbacks good enough to, survive a game if Gabriel were to get dinged up at some point this year? I don't think we know. Dante Moore threw 3 passes against Oregon State for 15 yards. It was all, quick hitter stuff. So I don't know that we can definitively say one way or the other whether he's a different guy from what he was a year ago, which was makes good throws at times, holds onto the football, and turns the ball over too much. That's why he transferred from UCLA. He's like, this isn't working. I need to go develop. That's what he's doing at Oregon right now. So if he gets into the game, then everything I've talked about, those questions have been answered in a positive direction for the Ducks. If he doesn't, it doesn't mean Oregon is playing a terrible game. That's not my barometer for success of, does Dante Moore get into the game? And if he doesn't, then Oregon's not playing well. No, not necessarily. Because, Oregon could have a 17, 20-point lead, midway through the fourth quarter, have the game in control, but you want to avoid, a potential disaster situation, and you keep Dylan Gabriel in there. If not, to just, at the very least, to just run the offense, execute it, not do anything drastic that lets UCLA get back into it. That'd be a different story. So, do you think I missed anything? Well, let me know in the YouTube comments or hit me up on X, formerly known as Twitter. 3 biggest keys to dominating UCLA. 3 biggest keys. Those are coming up next. Coming up right now, FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, guess what? You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, which is America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets. $200 bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com is the place to go. And if you want to bet college football, guess what? FanDuel's got that too. Oregon is a 24.5-point favorite, at least as I'm recording this show. Maybe it has gone up. And that's because Oregon is capable of winning this game by a lot of points. I'm about to tell you how they get to covering that number, which I think they're capable of doing. They're also capable, as we've seen, of not covering that number and making us all uncomfortable on Saturday night. But whatever you want, FanDuel's got it. Check them out, FanDuel.com. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Ice cold second segment sips beat anything else. And for my everydayers out there on YouTube, you notice, big ice guy. Don't know how the people in Europe do it. No ice, what are you doing? Why? Why would you do such a thing? I don't know. Let's talk about the biggest keys to Oregon dominating UCLA on Saturday. Now, this is not a guarantee that Oregon's going to accomplish all these things, but if they do these three things, I feel really good, and I mean really good, especially with the injuries UCLA's got working. A guy in the secondary, Keanu Williams, a former Duck, along the defensive line. There are a handful of former Ducks in this game. Jalen Davies, Brian Addison, Maliki Matavao, Williams, unfortunately won't be able to go with the injury, but plenty of former Ducks over there. There are some talented players that we know can make good football plays if Oregon isn't careful. But if Oregon goes out and executes, it'll look a lot like the Oregon State game. So, key number one, pressure Ethan Garbers. I think if Oregon's defense wants to have an outing that resembles the second half of the Oregon State game, in which they did not allow a single point, Garbers, I think, is better than Giovanni McCoy as a passer. He's not the runner that McCoy was, and that's something that gave Oregon's defense a little bit of fits in that first half. He had the 3rd and 15. He had to scramble to set up a touchdown. That was a factor. Garbers isn't going to do that. He's a pocket guy. Garbers is definitely a more talented passer. He's got a better arm. I think he's a little bit bigger. But, when he throws the ball down the field, he can complete some high-level throws. He doesn't do it consistently, but his overall lack of mobility is what limits him as a quarterback. If you don't give him sufficient protection, he's not going to make a play in a way that kills you. He's not going to be a Cam Ward type or a Caleb Williams or, list end. Heck, Aiden Childs next week against Michigan State. Really good athlete, moves incredibly well, and has a huge arm. Garber needs time from the pocket. But if you don't pressure him, make no mistake about it, Ethan Garbers can hurt you. We talked yesterday with Zach Anderson, Yoxheimer of Locked On UCLA. This receiving core, no joke. They got 3 guys, one of whom you might remember from his days at Cal, J. Michael Sturdivant, who isn't even their number 1 guy this year. They have got some receivers that he can throw the football to. Maliki Matavao, we know he's a very capable tight end. They have another guy, I think, who's solid as well. If you don't pressure Ethan Garbers, he can slice and dice you a little bit. He can read a defense all right, but he can make some big-time throws. So if you pressure him, I think that disrupts what they want to do offensively, and they've had a tendency to not lean on the run. Even though they have a couple of good running backs, I don't think their offensive line can really hold up in the run game the way that Bruins fans might want it to, and Eric Bieniemy has always been more of a pass-happy guy. And what's the best way to disrupt a passing attack? Disrupt the timing and rhythm of the quarterback. So pressuring Ethan Garbers, I think if you do that, Oregon can hold UCLA to 10 points, or frankly fewer if they play well. I think that is possible if they accomplish that. Key number 2, and this is one that goes both ways, win the line of scrimmage. UCLA is trying to figure things out along their offensive line. They lost the starter in Keanu Williams. Along the defensive line. Just had a flicker of a light in here, and I'm really glad the power didn't go out. I would have had to start this whole show over. That would have been a disaster area. Anyway, so win the line of scrimmage. If Oregon wins the line of scrimmage, I don't think this UCLA defense has got the horses to stop what Oregon wants to do. With the receivers and the running backs, I think you could see maybe not 7.5 yards a carry like they had against Oregon State last week. It could be in the 6 to 7 range, though, as a team. And individually, I wouldn't be surprised if Jordan James has a game where he, goes for 120 and averages 8 to 9 yards a carry. I wouldn't be surprised if Noah Whittington breaks another long touchdown run. I think this offensive line has found its groove, and they're going to be well rested. UCLA had to play last week. Oregon did not. I don't know that it's game-changing. It certainly does help that you're going to be fresh, even though you're not working in Matthew Bedford, who's coming back from an injury and hopefully gets a chance to play at some point this year. They just look so much more well-connected and in sync with how they were attacking run situations from an offensive line standpoint. And once you give Jordan James or Noah Whittington, or if Kenyon Sadiq has got the football, or Dylan Gabriel, whoever's running with the ball, you give them lanes, they're going to make plays. So you win the line of scrimmage, and UCLA's defense is not going to be able to stop this Oregon offense. And on the other side, it plays into key number one. They don't really want to run the football, even though Keegan Jones and TJ Harden are a good couple of backs. You win the line of scrimmage and pressure Ethan Garbers. I don't think they're going to have a lot offensively, because I don't think their running game is, to the point where they can lean on it. Like they have to move the ball through the air. That's what they were doing against LSU, and they hit some downfield shots. They had a couple back shoulder throws down the field that were really, really good. But I think that if Oregon wins the line of scrimmage, that contributes to a big victory and getting Dante Moore a little bit of run. And then lastly, protect the football. Now, you could have this as a key to victory in literally any football game, right? This is somewhat of a generic one, but there are always keys that you can, put in as vital going into a given matchup, no matter who's playing, right? Do X, do Y, do Z. I think something that I thought about, but is more a key for UCLA than it is for Oregon, is getting off to a hot start. If the Bruins go down and score a touchdown in their first drive and lead 7-0, I'm not worried at that point in time. But that's what UCLA needs. Does Oregon need to get off to a strong start? No. Would you like them to? Of course. What they need to do is protect the football, because this UCLA team is outmatched on paper. So when you're going up against a team that is outmatched talent-wise across the board, what do you need to do to capitalize on that advantage? Don't give them any breaks. Don't give them an opportunity to create an explosive play or to create a play that gets the crowd back into it. Like if you have a 17-7 lead and turn the football over, or, think of the Boise State game, which had a couple of different moments that could have swung it in Oregon's favor. One of them was the Patrick Herbert fumble. If he doesn't fumble, does Oregon go down and at least kick a field goal, if not score a touchdown, and take a 2-possession lead? And that game has a completely different tone and tenor. Same thing in the Idaho game. Driving down the field, 14-0 lead. Not a great offensive first half, but if you go down and score a touchdown or get a field goal, you have a 3-possession lead going into the break, and suddenly that game, I think, plays out a lot differently. But fumbles derailed those drives and allowed the game to swing back to a team that shouldn't have been able to play with Oregon. So I think if you protect the football, as they did against Oregon State, that's what this offense can be. It's Gabriel spreading the ball around, getting it out on time, delivering it accurately. He's over 80% completion on the year, which is insane. I mean, absolutely insane. What was his first 15 passes in a row against Oregon State? I don't care who you're throwing the football to or how open they are. That's really impressive. He can spin it. We've seen that. As long as he's protected and he's able to protect the football in the pocket, because he's had a couple fumbles this year, this Oregon offense should be just fine. I don't think UCLA's got the talent anywhere, really. I think their secondary got a couple of guys like Jalen Davies, solid player, not great, but solid, and Brian Addison, also pretty good player on the back end. So, and, he can fly around, he can hit guys, he can cover, he can make plays on the ball in the air. So I think if Oregon does those three things, pressure Ethan Garbers, win the line of scrimmage, protect the football, I think this one gets away from UCLA, and it feels for the Bruins a lot like the Indiana game, which was a final score of 42-13. I would have my score prediction on today's show. That's going to be on tomorrow's show. because that's how we roll here at Locked On Ducks. But the other way we roll is answering you guys' questions, many of which have been sent in, and I shall answer. How good does the Boise State win look right about now? Well, we're going to talk about that and why it does matter coming up next. First, we're going to talk about Prize Picks, which is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. Prize Picks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. All you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and then you watch the winnings roll in. Prize Picks is the best way to get action on sports in most states, including California, Texas, and Georgia. Prize Picks is the only real money daily fantasy platform with an injury insurance policy as well. This might be the best thing they offer. Your lineups stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. If your player leaves in the first half and doesn't return in Prize Picks, your picks are still alive. So that's why you need to go check them out. How? I'm so glad you asked. Download the Prize Picks app, use code LOCKEDONCollege, get $50 instantly when you play $5. That's code LOCKEDONCollege, all one word, on Prize Picks, get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to get the $50 bonus. How great is that? It's guaranteed. Prize Picks, run your game. Quick note before I get into a couple of questions here. I mentioned earlier this week when talking about recruiting that Lanning had made a remark about Alabama 5-star defensive back commit Dijon Lee. I had that flip-flopped. It was Dijon Lee who talked about Lanning, which makes a lot more sense because coaches can't typically comment about recruits, so I just wanted to set the record straight there. And I don't necessarily expect Oregon to flip the 5-star Alabama commit, but if there's a relationship, hey, you never know. Or maybe he's somebody who's playing for the Ducks in 2026. You know, if he goes to Alabama and whatnot, you never know. You never know. Never hurts to keep relationships, keep tabs on guys, and just, check in on them, see how they are doing. But wanted to make sure that was clarified. So, a couple questions to end today's show. And I love your guys' questions. YouTube comments, X, formerly known as Twitter. You can get in there. If you want priority access and all sorts of other perks, go join the flock over at Subtext. That link in the description below, wherever you listen to or watch the show. You can get a free 14-day trial. So, Matthew Bedford out. But a question coming into this game, there was no Matthew Bedford in that one. There's not going to be Matthew Bedford in this one. But I've actually gotten several questions from a handful of you out there about how the first 2 weeks look in retrospect. And I actually want to encompass that to all 3 games. So even though Idaho is a top 10 FCS team this year, that was still an unacceptably bad performance. Don't care who it is. Like, if you're supposed to be top 10 FBS, nobody at the FCS should be able to push you. At the best, that's like a mid-level Big 12 ACC team. And at worst, it's, the equivalent of a lower tier Mountain West team. Maybe mid-tier Mountain West, because Montana State quite literally went to New Mexico and beat the Lobos in Albuquerque, and they were actually really big favorites in that game. Montana State were. Anyway, getting sidetracked here. So the Idaho game, not going to talk my way into a circle about that one. But for Boise State, they're ranked in the top 25 coming into this week. They haven't wowed anyone yet. Like, the AP poll this week, frankly, is pretty bad. Boise State can justify what the AP voters did with them this week by beating Washington State. Washington State should be ranked. I know that Vegas is favoring Boise State because the game is in Boise. Washington State should be ranked. They have the more impressive resume. It's not even close. Washington State throttled Texas Tech, who looks like they're going to be a solid team in the Big 12, and they beat Washington on a neutral site. And Washington is not great this year, but Washington is not terrible either. They're probably a 6-7 win team in the Big 10. I know that Washington State struggled with San Jose State, but nevertheless, Boise State, you might look and see, oh, they're number 25. They shouldn't be. They could be in like the 30 range. They shouldn't be top 25. But they'll have a chance to prove that if they beat Washington State this week, then I'm okay ranking them. Boise State, I always felt was Oregon's toughest non-conference game. They're about what I expect them to be. I think they probably end the regular season 10-2, go to the Mountain West Championship game, And if they win, they'll be 11-2, which is exactly what I predicted for them over on Locked On College Football to start the year. So I think over time it can help Oregon, because even though it's a 12-team playoff, and if Oregon goes 10-2, in all likelihood that gets them into the playoff. Nothing's guaranteed. 11 wins guarantees you a spot in the college football playoff. But if it comes down to who gets a home playoff game or who gets into the playoff, if you're debating at-large resumes, yeah, you want Boise State to be good. So it does still matter in that sense. You know, it used to be like, oh, the BCS computers will see it this way, and that'll get us, you know, above this team there and whatnot. There's still that element in college football. It's still something that separates it from the NFL, even though they continue to look more and more alike, much to my chagrin in many, many ways. But for Boise State, they can be really good this year. They can hang around the top 25 all year, and that's good for Oregon. And I said at the time, continue to think more and more as Boise State plays out their season and looks as good as, you know, they were expected to be coming into this year. The Boise State game was a significant upgrade in overall performance from Idaho. There were just some key lapses. There were some key lapses. It was sloppy. It was clumsy. The fumble from Herbert, the fumble from Gabriel, not being able to tackle, bad run fits. Like, they fixed a lot of that stuff against Oregon State, which, going back to the first segment on today's show, is what we want to see against the Bruins. We want to see that stuff continue to get cleaned up, because that's a very natural thing for any team in the country. I mean, Ohio State was getting pushed by Marshall for a quarter and a half. And if not for an offsides on a punt, Marshall would have had the ball inside Ohio State's 10-yard line because they muffed it. I think it was like 14-7 at that point, 7-7. Like, it was a close competitive game in the second quarter. And then that happened. Then Ohio State put their foot on the gas pedal. But no one's playing their best football early in the year, or at least, frankly, you don't want to necessarily, because you want to peak at the right time, which is probably not the sort of language Dan Lanning would ever use to describe how he wants his team to play week in and week out. But I think the Oregon State game also factors in here. Oregon State beat Purdue 38-21. I don't know if you saw that last week. That game was in Corvallis, and the Bees were just a better team. Now, they have a handful of Power 4 opponents on their schedule left. They've got Washington State, they've got Cal, they've already played Oregon and Purdue. I think those are the big games they can play, and then they'll play everybody in the Mountain West. They'll play Boise State, I know. I don't remember if they play Fresno, but I don't think Oregon State can move the needle as much as Boise State can, unless the Beavs surprise everyone, go 10-2. If they do that, which I don't suspect they will, but if Boise State goes 10-2, yeah, you might look back and say, that was a top 25 win. Wow, we were all hating on Oregon because they struggled with one of the 25 best teams in the college football, according to the system that we have set up in this beautiful, wonderful, and crazy sport. So, got a couple questions about that, and I think Boise State can do a lot more to bolster Oregon's schedule and the perception of the non-conference, which isn't the strongest but not the weakest I've ever seen, than Oregon State likely can, unless the Beavs were to wind up at 10-2 at the end of the year. But we'll see how Boise State plays against Washington State this week. Cougs are good. Cougs are a good football team. This question came in from Rick. This is how we're wrapping up today's show. What are we doing with recruiting this year? The staff is intentionally recruiting a smaller class this year. Big game hunting, but why? What are your thoughts on this? P.S. Love the show, both of them. Appreciate that, Rick. So I think for Oregon and this 2025 recruiting class, which is going to be significantly smaller by, we don't know how many are going to wind up in the 2025 class. It's going to be like 8 to 10 kids or more smaller in terms of the number of commits that you have in the cycle. I don't mind them going big game hunting for two reasons. Number one, the last two recruiting classes have been really, really good. And so far, the player retention from those recruiting classes is very high. I think the reason the staff feels like they can go after quality over quantity in this 25 cycle, and there are plenty of quality guys in the last two classes as well, is twofold. Number one, they feel good about what they can do in the transfer portal. And number two, they feel good about the players from the last two cycles, the 23 and 24 classes, sticking around. That they don't think there's going to be a mass exodus and suddenly you're going to have holes on your roster and your two deep is going to be thin. You're scrambling to find transfers. I think that's the back and forth that they're looking at and why it's not higher. And look, if you if you got an honest remark from Dan Lanning or any of the coaches, they want to have more kids than they currently have. Like, there's no doubt about it. I mean, do you think they wanted to miss on Lincoln Cure? Do you think they wanted Deshaun Brame to flip to Tennessee? Do you think they want? No, of course. They offer those guys and recruit them and get down in their top 3, top 5. And, we're hanging on the edge seeing where they're going to commit for a reason, because the staff wants them. So I think you're going to see several commitments throughout the course of the season. I don't know if this class will even get to 20, and I think that's okay for the reasons that I outlined. Appreciate the question. Keep them coming in. Thanks for making this your first listen or first view of the day. Go make Locked On College Football your second. It's a great time over there, talking about the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.